All right, so I said 5 minutes past, but I think that in the interest of time we should probably get started. And I can see that we have quite a few people who have joined us since. So welcome to everyone, and welcome to our Monday colloquium. And it is my pleasure to be able to introduce you to Dr. Philippa Kerr, who is our speaker today. And Philippa is a postdoctoral fellow affiliated with the psychology department at Stellenbosch and has been since July 2020. And she has a PhD in social psychology from the University of KwaZulu-Natal and has researched anti-immigrant violence in the Western Cape. And more recently, the causalization of academic work, or the casualization of academic work in universities. And since 2011, she's worked on short contracts at 5 different universities: KZN, UCT, University of the Free State, University of Oslo, as well as Stellenbosch. And she is involved in postdoctoral politics at UFS, and on the side is an artist and musician. That's quite interesting. So Philippa is also funded by the National Research Foundation, and I'm very pleased to welcome her here today. And I will stop sharing my screen, Philippa, so that you can share yours, and then perhaps you can, via video, show us who you are and tell us more about your talk today. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Bronwyn. Won't you let me know if you can see my slides?
I'll do so.
Okay, they should be coming.
Yes, I can see your slides.
Okay, great. All right. Can I see my own slides? I can still see you, Bronwyn.
Okay.
How will I get it back to?
If you look at the bottom of your screen, there will be 2 windows for Teams. The second window should have your presentation view.
Oh, I don't see that.
If you try to minimize the window with me in it.
Then I just get back to my slides in PowerPoint. Oh, there I can see you. All right, well, I'll just keep going. As long as everyone can see me and hear me and see the slides, I think that's fine.
Yes, you can also just maximize your slides if you want to, because we can see the sidebar too.
Oh, I see. Oh, I see. Okay. All right. Slideshow. Okay, well, thank you everyone for being here. My name is Philippa Kerr, as Bronwyn said, and I've changed the title of my talk slightly from what was in the abstract. I've called the talk How the Postdoctoral Fellow System in South Africa is Deprofessionalizing Academic Work, and I'll explain what I mean by that as we go along. Thank you once again to Bronwyn for helping this, for putting it together, this platform. So can you, just to check, are you seeing that my slides are ticking over? Okay, great. So the case that I'm going to make in this talk is that the postdoctoral fellow system is deprofessionalizing academic work by transforming it into non-work that is done by non-employees. And this process of deprofessionalization is obscured with a misleading discourse of postdoctoral fellowships as professional development opportunities and as preparation for an academic career. And what I've described with a bit of tongue-in-cheek, but also not too much tongue-in-cheek, is as a system-wide swindle is sustained partly by patronage relationships between universities, hosts, and postdocs. So how things started with my interest in the postdoctoral fellow system? Well, firstly, with personal experience. I'm on my 3rd postdoctoral fellowship now. I've been a postdoc for 4 years in total. And to some extent, I experienced the transition to a postdoctoral fellowship as a kind of demotion to non-employee status, despite my increasing academic accomplishments. So obviously you do a postdoctoral fellowship after your PhD, but after I got a PhD, I became a non-employee, even though I had previously been done various types of academic work in the university system. I've had some difficult relationships with postdoctoral hosts, and also, although my disciplinary background, as Bronwyn said, is in psychology, through a series of historical contingencies, I ended up spending some time in a higher education studies department, where these things became imaginable as an actual focus of study, and not just the context in which I was trying to do other work. In 2019, I applied for NRF postdoctoral funding to research the casualization of academic labor in South African universities, and that application was successful. Then, meantime, I also negotiated with Professor Leslie Swartz here in this department to be my host. Leslie, unfortunately, wasn't able to be here today, but we've talked about quite a lot of these issues at some length already. I joined up with Stellenbosch University in July 2020, and I'm now writing mostly about the postdoc system specifically. As I said, the focus here is slightly different to what is in the abstract. That was going to focus on mentorship and patronage relationships, but that's just going to be one part of this talk. So the case that I'm making here, it depends on a kind of autoethnography, which has been a process of trying to understand my own situation in universities over the last 10 years, and more specifically over the last 4 years as a postdoctoral fellow. It draws on my own observations and employment history, some interviews, a lot of reading, reading sometimes between the lines of policy documents and websites, attendance at meeting and conferences, responses from peer reviews, and so on. And this research has been, in some ways, a process of joining the dots, because there's so little research that directly addresses the postdoctoral fellow system. So what is meant by the casualization and deprofessionalization of academic work? Well, in the last few years, there's been an explosion of recent research on the erosion of academic job security and declining conditions of work, even for permanent academics, along with the rise of managerialism in universities. A lot of this research comes out of Australia, the UK, and the US, because I think those are places where these processes have been especially rampant. A long time ago, in 2003 already, Kimber diagnosed a two-tier system in the academic profession in Australia, which she described as the tenured core and the tenuous periphery. And what she meant by that was the tenured core is a shrinking group of permanent academics with secure work conditions, what you may consider as a sort of traditional academic permanent job. But they are now increasingly supported by and surrounded by a growing group of academics who take bear a lot of the teaching responsibility and a lot of the research workload, but on very, very tenuous conditions of employment. In Australia, those academics are called sessional lecturers, and they work on a sort of semester to semester, or sometimes even a sort of week to week basis. And in Australia, in the States, they are called adjunct professors. And that group of academics bears a heavier and heavier responsibility for core academic work. And so in this context, a survey by May and colleagues from 2013, also in Australia, argued that in such a context, temporary academic work can no longer be seen as a stepping stone to more secure work. But rather this kind of temporary work is its own, is essentially an end in itself. And Bozon and colleagues from 2019, talking about the shift to a precarious academic workforce in Europe, spoke about the economics of promises, where universities continue to give the implication or the suggestion that continuing with temporary academic work will eventually lead to something more secure. But that can obscure the way that, in fact, in many cases, the aim is now not to train newcomers for secure jobs, but to replace those jobs with precarious and unpaid ones. So it's quite a bleak literature. So to what extent is this conversation happening in South Africa? In my reading of the higher education literature and policy literature, hardly at all. there's hardly any concern with casualization so far, despite the indication that 2/3 of South African academics are on fixed-term contracts. And that's from the Council for Higher Education Vital Stats document, which is put out every year. That figure, 2/3 being on non-permanent contracts, has been stable for about at least a decade. But of course, those figures don't really tell you how much academic work is being done by those people. So that could include everybody from like academics who are doing a full workload but on a fixed term contract, right down to somebody who maybe does a couple of hours as a visiting lecturer and who will also be on the university's books for that, but is not doing a full workload. So it doesn't tell us how much, but it does tell us the number of people. There are a handful of papers on postdoctoral fellows. There are some early suggestions based on qualitative research that postdocs are in a bottleneck. There's a bottleneck problem, that's Simmons and Bitzer, or in my term, a parallel pipeline that doesn't actually lead anywhere, and that many postdocs will not, many postdocs end up spending protracted periods in postdoctoral fellowships. There's a review paper from Moyo 2020 of reviewing international literature on postdocs, and one of Moyo's insights is that host institutions benefit from international academic labor without providing professional security. And then there are a couple of other papers by Holly and colleagues and Dick and Painter, who both refer to the way that postdocs are cheap for universities because the stipends that they earn are relatively low, and increasingly they are used to do research and publication when permanent staff are overworked, sometimes in South African departments are overworked with teaching and admin. So increasingly postdocs are sort of taking up the slack of traditional academic roles of departments. So that's basically it. I mean, of course, when you try and diagnose a whole field, there's obviously, it could just be that I haven't read. There might be other stuff that I just haven't read. But as far as I know, there's very little about postdocs or about temporary academics more generally. And most significantly, there are some important places in the literature and the policy conversations where postdocs and other forms of temporary academics are, as far as I can see, totally absent. For example, the conversation about the academic pipeline. So what is meant by that? South African higher education policy and academic literature is very concerned with the low proportion of permanent academics with PhDs. Yet at the same time, there is almost no mention of postdoctoral fellows. And my estimate is that there are somewhere between 3,000 and 4,500 postdocs, although there could be even more, as a source of PhD qualified academics to fill this gap. And that is despite the fact that the universities and the National Research Foundation continue to promise that postdoctoral fellowships are preparation for an academic career. So what do I mean by the academic pipeline? So Johan Mouton and colleagues from here at Stellenbosch wrote a big landmark report in 2018, which they called Building a Cadre of Emerging Scholars for Higher Education in South Africa. It was commissioned by the Department of Science and Technology, and the aim of the research was to establish the proportion and demographics of academics at lecturer and senior lectural levels / all levels of the permanent instruction staff at higher education institutions who are active researchers as well as those who are not active researchers. And this stemmed from a concern that there might be a large number of academics in universities who were somehow not doing any research or little, and so they wanted to establish, is that the case, and also what are the barriers to research then in that case. So in terms of their findings, they found that less than half of senior lecturers and only a quarter of lecturers at South African universities can realistically be deemed as active publishing authors by using an extremely weak threshold of authoring at least 2 articles over the past 10 years. And here's both their explanation for why and their recommendations for what to do about that. And it's a bit of a long paragraph, but I'm going to read the whole thing. So they say the biggest structural barrier to increasing the number of active emerging scholars in the South African higher education system is the fact that very low percentages of senior lecturers and lecturers are in possession of a doctorate degree. The average percentage of South African academics with a doctorate remains low, less than 50%, and has not increased significantly over the past 5 years. The National Development Plan has set a target of 75% of South African academics being in possession of a doctorate by 2030. Given recent trends, it is clear that this target will not be achieved. It is imperative that the universities intensify their efforts to support larger numbers of their lecturers and senior lecturers to obtain doctoral degrees, and that they design and implement innovative interventions to achieve this. So that basically sums up the concern with the sustainability of the academic profession, and a concern about how the academic profession is going to sustain itself, given, of course, that only people with PhDs can supervise new PhDs and so on. So as I was reading this, I thought to myself, surely are postdocs not an obvious solution to this problem? We postdocs are by definition required to have PhDs, and we are supposed to be getting prepared for an academic career, are we not? So surely postdocs are sort of already available pool of academics that could be drawn on. For example, here's the way that the framework document for my NRF fellowship describes one of the objectives of these postdoctoral fellowships that currently give me my funding. So they say that one of the objectives is to enable young scientists and professionals to access world-class strategic and applied research opportunities in a university environment, and thereby strengthen their research profiles and consequently improve their prospects of permanent employment in the national system of innovation. Stellenbosch University on its website also makes a similar suggestion. They say our postdoctoral research fellows are productive and valuable members of Stellenbosch University. They make a substantial contribution towards meeting research output and capacity development goals. The main goal of a postdoctoral research fellowship remains the development and honing of research and professional skills in preparation for a future academic or other professional career. Each postdoc at SU is supervised and mentored by a host, and so on. So there isn't time to go through a detailed discussion of how this of how these suggestions are made, but I'm writing a paper about how many of the universities have web pages which make similar promises about postdoctoral fellowships being preparation for an academic career. Yet postdocs seem to be sort of missing from those discussions about the academic pipeline. And also, the little available evidence that there is suggests that many postdocs will not find secure academic work. And in my experience, research managers also have admitted this at unguarded moments. So not so long ago, I was in a meeting of postdocs, and there was somebody from the research development division in attendance, and the conversation turned to the long-term prospects of postdocs, and the person from DRD said, oh no, most postdocs are definitely not going to find permanent academic work. There's a huge misalignment in the system. So what is really going on then, and why are postdocs here if it seems increasingly unlikely that we are going to be in the future of the South African academic profession? And my sort of developing case, this is a tentative case, but it's a case that I'm making, is that the higher education system is incentivizing universities to keep research productive academics outside of secure employment. And the process that enables that is the transformation of academic work into units that are exchangeable for money and prestige. By that, I obviously mean the way that the Department of Higher Education and Training allocates research funding to some extent in exchange for the number of papers.
Hi, Philippa.
When universities orient towards trying to maximize their revenue and their prestige.
Sorry to interrupt. I don't know if anybody else is experiencing a connection issue. It could totally just be on my side. But just to say, there was a slight little break there with a delayed connection. Okay. Sorry for interrupting.
No problem. Can you hear me now?
It seems stable now, yeah.
All right. I connect through my phone, so yeah, sorry about that.
No problem. As I said, it could be my side. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll restate this slide. The case that I'm making is that the higher education system is incentivizing universities to keep research productive academics outside of secure employment. And the process, the sort of underpinning process that enables that is the transformation of academic work into units that are exchangeable for money and prestige. And a number of other people have already, this has become quite a common thing that is debated in South African universities, which is the sometimes perverse consequences of the way DHET, the Department of Higher Education and Training, allocates the higher education budget in partial return for how many academic publications and PhD and master's graduates each university produces every year. So in giving academic like journal articles a direct financial value and a prestige value in terms of how this works to rank universities, I think this is the sort of fundamental process that has enabled this incentive and these incentives, and I'll explain what I mean now. So I think these incentives, maybe I'm skipping ahead of myself a little bit here, but these incentives, which I haven't said yet, but I'll get to them, also dovetail quite neatly with a kind of human capital development discourse that is very prominent in higher education at government higher education discourse, which promises that investing in skills will lead to job creation, but oftentimes the systems have no way of concretizing this promise. And I'll say a little bit more about that just now. So what can these incentives to casualization be? Well, the first is that the Department of Higher Education and Training ranks universities with a formula for calculating a per capita research output score, which it does, as far as I can work out, by dividing a university's total research outputs every year. So that's publications, research master's graduates, and PhD graduates. They add those up and they divide them by the number of permanent staff only. So irrespective of who produced the research outputs, it's divided by permanent staff only. And so obviously that means that the smaller the number of permanent staff is, that will be on the bottom side of that division sum, the better your final score is going to be. So here's, I just copied this from the DHET 2019 annual report of research productivity at the universities. And you can see that this table is how the universities have been ranked. So on the far left column, it says institution, University of Pretoria, Stellenbosch, Rhodes, Wits, and so it goes down. In the next column is head count of permanently employed academics. Then the next column is research publication units. And then if you skip over twice, it's research master's graduates units, then doctoral graduate units, then overall research output units, and then it divides that by the number of permanently employed academics. And so at the University of Pretoria, the research per capita score is 3.38. All the way down to Mangosuthu University of Technology, where it's 0.12. So as I said here on the left, I put this comment to say, I don't know if universities are actively orienting towards this metric. Like, I don't know how deliberately universities pursue a higher place in this local DHET ranking, but it certainly seems, if I've understood it correctly, it certainly seems to reward casualization. Another potential incentive is the way that employment equity and transformation are only audited as they apply to permanent jobs. No, let me state that again, are only audited in permanent jobs. So what postdoctoral fellowships do, and again, I don't know whether it's fair to say that universities are actively pursuing this, but this is the effect that they have, is that postdoctoral fellowships allow universities to reap the research outputs of postdocs who would probably not otherwise be prioritized for employment and who would not help the employment equity figures. So again, this runs on the transformation of academic work into units, and also to some extent, this implies a critique of employment equity as a kind of surface there becomes a kind of a politics of appearances or surface measures of success. Also, I think because there's so little research on postdocs, it's difficult to say any of these things strongly. But what it looks to me like, from my understanding of the system, is that once again there is an underrepresentation of Black South Africans amongst postdocs. So if postdocs are the so-called pipeline, then there's there's a kind of a mismatch there. And then thirdly, it's important to understand the legal basis of that transforms postdocs into students who earn scholarships rather than earning salaries for services rendered. So what do I mean by this? It took me quite a long time to understand this legal basis, because all postdocs, understand that they are not actually university employees. But why this was for a long time quite obscure to me. So there's a tax law loophole, and in the beginning, I think postdoctoral fellowships were initially envisaged as a form of elite and advanced training for people who already had PhDs. So postdocs were classified as students who were going to be doing a kind of very advanced training under the mentorship of senior successful academics. But in practice, the training element has often largely fallen away. And postdocs have now become a mass system. It's not really an elite system anymore, I don't think. And postdocs are now simply required to oftentimes do academic work, to research, to publish, sometimes to supervise, and sometimes to teach and to lecture. But the student status of postdocs continues to dog us. And the Income Tax Act distinguishes between an income which is for studies, a scholarships and bursaries, and a salary which is an income for work. So obviously the Income Tax Act requires tax to be paid on a salary that is earned for services rendered, but scholarships are exempt from tax. So if you get a scholarship that allows you to go to university or do postgrad, you don't have to pay tax on that scholarship. But then it becomes very important to define what exactly counts as studies. So the Tax Act, or SARS, defines studies as something that you do for your own learning or your own education, or the expansion of your own skills or knowledge or aptitude. And it specifically says that research undertaken for an employer is not counted as studies. So postdocs' activities have to be sort of retrospectively repackaged as non-work, or as something that we do for our own learning, definitely not research undertaken for an employer, in order for the income that we receive to minimally qualify as a scholarship. Otherwise, in my reading, it would be illegal that postdocs don't pay income tax. Because if you're an employee and you're not paying income tax, I mean, then you're on the wrong side of the law. And so that explains, I think, the language of postdocs as interns, trainees, learners, and so on. Everywhere on the university websites and in other places, postdocs are described as essentially learners and not as professional academics. And so what this also does, and this is back to the incentives that I was talking about earlier, is that having a group of research productive academics outside of employment enables a reaping of research outputs much more cheaply than would otherwise be possible. And then very briefly, just to say something about human capital discourse, I think there's a whole paper could be written on the implications of human capital theory for higher education and for postdocs. But from what I can read, when I read the framework documents for my own NRF fellowship and other documents, is that the NRF is informed by the logic of human capital development, which assumes that skilling the workforce will lead to more jobs. And that is very clearly articulated, for example, in the quote that I read earlier from the framework document of my own NRF fellowship. But Stephanie Allais at WITS has pointed out that human capital theory never gets around to specifying how exactly that production of jobs will happen. And what could happen instead is that it could just lead to a kind of arms race of competition for a few good jobs, where people become more and more highly skilled, and they compete with other people who are also increasingly skilled for a limited number of jobs. And I think that in this case, there's a danger that development, like human capital development or skills development, can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the state is diverting a lot of money to development programs, but it's actually shrinking the number of academic vacancies, or at least not growing as they should, the number of academic vacancies. So what is going to happen to all of these developed postdocs if no real vacancies open up to absorb them? So my diagnosis of the postdoc system from this in this analysis is that the system is a dishonest one. I also think it's borderline illegal. If we think of those, if we think of that tax law stuff, certainly it's really nonsensical, because in practice there is really no difference between the research that postdocs do for so-called learning purposes and the research that academics in employment do as work for their employer. In no sense is postdocs' work treated differently. It's not treated differently when you submit things to journals. It's not treated differently in terms of how much money it brings in, and so on. Yet universities continue to give misleading messages about postdocs' bright prospects, when in practice there are few or no mechanisms I don't see for them to concretize this promise. This is what I mean when I say the system is deprofessionalizing academic work. This work is now transformed into a kind of non-work done by non-employees and non-professionals. And as I've said, the key mechanism for this is the transformation of academic work into units that are exchangeable for money and prestige. So we have a system that essentially prioritizes outputs rather than livelihoods. And in the last part of this talk, I want to address the question of why is there so little outrage about this system? If the system is, as I've said, which probably not everyone would agree, why is there so little challenge to the system? And I have a few suggestions. Oh yeah, there's very little challenge, including from postdocs. One, I think, is the ubiquity of the professional development discourse. Everywhere you look, you are told that postdocs are opportunities for professional development. It comes up in the policy documents, it comes up in postdoc events, postdoc conferences, it comes from managers, and so on. And it took me basically a whole research project to see how I'm being misled by that discourse. I also think that with the rise of managerialism in universities, this has gone along with the shutting down of critique and questions, not only for postdocs, but just as a more general trend. And often I think that postdocs receive a lot of patronizing and infantilizing treatment from managers, where postdocs are seldom consulted as experts on their own situation, but instead are told what we should think of our own situation. So we are told that we are very valuable, we are told that we should be very grateful for this opportunity, and when the system is couched in these kinds of terms, it becomes very difficult to formulate a critical response to this without seeming antagonistic and aggressive. I know from the little experience I have at being involved in postdoctoral politics and postdoctoral events is that university managers often become very defensive as soon as you start to ask critical questions about the postdoc system. For example, what are our prospects of employment really, and things like that. Postdocs are also unprotected by human resources procedures or by labor law because we are not employees. And perhaps most importantly is the way that sometimes hosts directly control a postdoc's income. And that's, I think, where the potential for patronage comes in. And here we get to the point that I was making in the original abstract for this talk. To what extent are postdoctoral hosts mentors, and to what extent does the system constitute them as patrons, irrespective of their personal intentions or their personal goodwill towards postdocs? So what do I mean by patronage? Well, I found I was looking around for definitions or for discussions of this term to see, is this a good term for what I'm talking about? And I found two different ways of thinking about patronage. One is patronage as opposed to equal opportunity. So Martin, 2009, was concerned with a person about patronage as when a person or a group with power dispenses favors to favorites or insiders and not on the basis of merit. So that's one way. Another way of thinking about patronage is by comparing it with mentorship. And here I found a definition by somebody called Dr. Katie Barnett on Twitter. She said, patrons collect followers and reward them for loyalty. Those who don't support the patron are in comparison with mentors who support juniors with no expectation of support in return. So those are both different ways of thinking about patronage, and to some extent, I think they both apply to postdoctoral fellowships. I made this little table of my own experience in 3 different postdoctoral fellowships here, and I've what was a bit of application process for that postdoctoral fellowship, and did the host control my income directly? So in the first fellowship, yes, there was a competitive application process. I applied to an open call, I was interviewed, and I was selected as the successful applicant, but the host personally controlled my income. In fellowship 2, there was no competitive application. I got to know a professor who had a budget, and for reasons which were not intended, the effects that this dependence on patrons can have. So he says, casual staff experience is the condition of the innovated precarity that has become a structural feature of contemporary universities, undermining job security and the possibility that durable skills can be slowly accrued in fixed communities of practice. Members of the academic precariat or cognitariat are unable to make plans, purchase property, or start a family. Their dependence on the continued patronage of tenured mentors in offering them work undermines their ability to become politically active in challenging the system of creeping casualization that maintains them in poverty and powerlessness. So postdoctoral fellowships often don't involve transparent application processes. They depend very heavily on personal connections having been made and networks. As I've said, sometimes a host personally controls a postdoc's income as well as their institutional affiliation. And even if you have external funding, typically your host has to sign off on your application for this. So it creates a very, very highly unequal power balance where a postdoc depends for many things on their host, whereas the host obviously depends much less on the postdoc. And to some extent, the universities themselves confirm that these types of networks is how the system should work. So this is from the WITS postdoc website. It says, the best way for you to get started is to find a host who is prepared to mentor you during the fellowship. This means finding a WITS academic who works in a similar field of research to you. It helps to choose someone you know, or at least you know their work. Your potential host will help you secure the necessary funding by asking you to write funding applications to the university or through one of the external funders like the NRF. So this is a clear example of how networks create connections. As an aside, we can ask how honest is the claim that our hosts are in fact mentors? I've heard it said by research managers, you cannot expect your hosts to mentor you. Their key performance indicators don't involve recognition for mentoring postdocs. Just as an aside. How are we doing for time? I think I should bring it to a close. So in my experience, The line between patronage and mentorship is fine. Is a fine line. When you depend heavily on one person, the need to not piss off your host becomes paramount. And I know that's a bit of a funny term to use in an academic presentation, but that can be what it becomes about. And this can involve quite a lot of emotional labor to keep the relationship between you and your host sweet, or avoid the imminent disaster of making them lose patience with you. In some cases, disloyalty or critique are punished, even if by omission. And by that I mean maybe your host doesn't, go out of their way to punish you, but they may just sort of stop sending you opportunities, or they may stop putting themselves out to help you, etc., etc. So in terms of concluding thoughts, my case is that the postdoc system is cheapening and devaluing the value of a PhD and of academic work. It runs on the transformation of academic work into outputs which now have an exchange value. And it is supported by institutional paternalism and patronage systems. For postdocs, in terms of thinking about how the system could be different, I think one of the problems is that the instrumentalizing of academic work as something that is now has a monetary value attached has been so thorough that it is actually difficult to think about the value of our work outside of these terms. And if DHET's research incentives disappeared, for example, because many people have recognized that the financial incentives are a source of many problems in the system, but if those incentives disappeared, there may be no need for postdoctoral fellowships as they are currently configured. Because if we are mostly here to just bolster the university's research outputs, then if those incentives disappeared, then what would actually be the point of having postdocs? And so that presents conundrums for reform efforts because for all the reasons that I've explained above. So that brings me to the end of the talk. And if we have time, I hope that there might be time for questions and responses. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philippa, and for addressing this very important topic. And there's already quite a bit of comments and people wanting to interact with you. And the first person is Sarah Black. So Sarah, I hand over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Philippa, for articulating, I think, a lot of people's lived experiences. I'm in a postdoc like you. Precarity, the emotional labor involved in managing to tread water in that precarity is very, very real. Just to kind of give you a sense of where I come from, I'm a policy specialist in education sociology. That's what my doctorate is in. And unfortunately, one of the things that I think we miss in the South African case is that we notice the specificities of our national situation. For example, the incentives that the DHET provides that are a particular instantiation of this labor relations structure. But number one, it's not unique to obviously the situation. This is the effects of the gig economy across multiple sectors of labor around the world. It has a particular flavor and a particular visibility actually under neoliberal moments where because we have this obsession with accountability and metrics and things like incentives and numbers of papers put out every year, etc., it becomes a little bit more visible, a little bit more bald-faced, if you like. But if you look at Pierre Bourdieu's work on the inheritors of the French university system back in the 1970s, it was exactly the same. It is patronage, it is social capital, it is hooking yourself to the correct coattails of a dominant professor in the École Paris or wherever it was. We happen to be a little bit of a lag behind in South Africa, and I think we have a particular relationship in our public institutions regarding the state as a source of producing employment in the South African case. But the whole academic inflation thing, the whole precarity that you've outlined, the shortening of temporal horizons of planning, inability to, constantly being kept in a perpetual rat mouse wheel, as well as I think you pointed out or asked a very interesting question regarding why is there not outrage? And you mentioned human capital theory, but there's been some very good work by Byung-Chul Han, who's a really interesting German philosopher, about the kinds of subjectivities that neoliberalism produces, or Lauren Berlin's cruel optimism. Why do we stay attached to the promise of a good life when all the empirical evidence suggests that it's never forthcoming. So Lauren Berland also offers us an understanding about why there isn't outrage, why we continue to buy into the mythos, despite the fact that our rational brain knows otherwise. And the answer is simple. It's the only answer that has ever addressed gig economy and precariat work arrangements, which always privatizes profits and socializes losses, and that is labor organizing. I was really interested to read about the Triangle shirt waste factory fire back in 1910. I thought the gig economy was something of the 21st century, but exactly the same types of labor relations happening there, but in a different sector. And the only way to get around it, I'm afraid Karl Marx was wrong about communism, he was absolutely right about capitalism, is labor organizing. So one of the things I found very frustrating, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this, is my inability to organize my fellow postdocs at the University of Johannesburg. We are on this terrible treadmill where we literally every quarter have to report how many DHET accredited articles we have published. Even when we say, look, COVID has shut down review turnaround times. You know, I've submitted 5 pieces of work this year. The reviewers have not got back. I was told straight up by the dean, that's not a problem. And it was blatant gaslighting to be told straight up by my dean, no, reviewers are not, review turnaround times are not a problem because of COVID. Even though, you know, you've submitted the work and none of the reviewers have got back to you for 6 months, 8 months, a year. And one of the things is the difficulty in getting over that promise of a better life, of trying to get our fellow postdocs to imagine differently about and see these structural and discursive relations that you've just described in a way that will enable us to organize together and stand in solidarity, because alone we're not going to get anywhere. So I'd love to hear your experiences about working in labor organization with postdocs. Won't you please share that with us? Thank you.
Bronwyn, I don't know how you want to do it. Do you normally take a number of questions, or should I answer that straight away?
I think answer straight away. Yeah, and then we can take a next one.
Okay. Well, gee, my limited experience, I don't want to make it sound more than it was, but I was also involved with postdocs at my previous university with trying to establish an association, a postdocs association. It failed in the end, partly because of postdoc turnover. And there was some, and the intervention of COVID. There was some initial momentum, which some of the university employees helped to sort of mobilize. We started out with, how did it work? There was going to be, at the beginning of 2018, there was an upcoming meeting where all the postdocs at the university were going to meet with the Vice Chancellor. So just coincidentally, the day before that meeting, we had a postdoc sort of social lunch. So I and a few other people stood up and said, guys, let's take this opportunity to present to the Vice Chancellor all of our concerns, and, you know, in an organized fashion. And so I was sort of voted by popular vote to be the spokesperson or one of the spokespeople at that meeting. And so we had meanwhile been collecting postdoc concerns, and many people had been involved in collecting those concerns. So we said them to the Vice Chancellor. And the Vice Chancellor himself, interestingly, said, you guys should organize yourselves into a postdocs association. So we were very excited about that and positive, and, you know, we thought, oh, great. And then it turned into a struggle with the other university managers who were actually the more directly responsible ones for making that happen. And we sort of lost touch with the Vice Chancellor, and he became inaccessible, or in my experience, he became inaccessible, and he was no longer sort of available to say, you know, but help us. You were the one who said you want us to be in an association, but now you're not helping us to make that happen. And there was a lot of, on my side, there was a lot of back and forth about whether to organize under the roof of the university, when we were sort of well aware that the senior management and the top management were obviously going to try and control that and make it so that the Postdocs Association was as toothless as possible. So there was, gee, it's hard to now remember all the details of the order in which things happened, but at some point there was an election, and some people were elected to positions, but and we had some meetings with the top management. They put it on our shoulders to make a sort of a constitution for a postdocs association, but then they proceeded to like override all the procedures that we had stated in that constitution for how to run an election and stuff. So it seemed like they weren't taking it seriously. They weren't serious. They were sort of doing what the vice chancellor had said, like, oh, we have to now go through the motions of making a postdoc society. But the actual people whose sort of responsibility that was didn't ever seem serious. And eventually I left the university and then others left, and then it was COVID. And the people that I know who are still at that university, there's no postdoc activity going or no activity towards the association happening as far as I understand. Then there's the current Postdocs Association here at Stellenbosch University. That's very organized and active in the sense that it meets 4 times a year, and there's a very transparent, good election process for electing representatives and stuff. But as I see it, it's not really, first of all, I don't think we have any actual say in any like university governance procedures. So like we can talk amongst ourselves, but our postdoc representative, our elected head, doesn't like sit on the Senate or anything, as far as I understand. I mean, unless I've missed something glaring. And also it so far, I mean, I'm not really involved in leadership. I just have attended some of the meetings, but it's much more geared towards like sort of facilitating the system as it is, rather than like challenging the system, so to say. So yeah, I think I should end it there. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Philippa. We have some comments here as well, but I know that Daniel had his hand up. Daniel, I'm quickly going to read through these comments, and then if you'd like to ask a question next. So Philippa, there's a comment here that this is a wonderful presentation, well articulated. As a postdoc, the uncertainty of employment is really concerning. There's no stability, 1-year contracts all the time, and it would be more stable to have 5-year contracts, and this 1-year thing is very scary. And then there's another comment that says, how viable would it be to merge the outcomes of a postdoc fellowship with actually acquiring your PhD, such as the professional development and mentoring? As a student who is considering a PhD in academic career, this is actually all quite anxiety provoking. So yeah.
Can I
so
just
sure.
sorry, I can't see the bottom of that comment. Oh, there it is. How viable would it be to merge the outcomes of a postdoc fellowship with actually acquiring your PhD, such as the professional development and mentoring? Can you just can the person who asked that question just explain what you mean by that, by merging the outcomes?
Yeah. Hi, Philippa. Thanks for the presentation so far.
Hi.
It's just from the sounds of it, the postdoctoral fellowship, the outcomes is for you to get some professional development and experience and so on. Would it not be a possibility then to do all that while acquiring your PhD, whereas you get developed, you get the training and the mentorship to become an academic while you are pursuing your PhD?
I see. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's like the whole question. That's exactly what I see it. Like, surely a PhD is preparation for an academic career. And now you get to the end of your PhD and you're told, oh, no, you still need more professional development. You still need more mentorship.
Yeah.
And it really raises the question, well, you know, not only is that a delaying tactic and a diversion tactic for, you know, the fact that we're probably not ever going to get jobs, many people, some are, but even while, you know, even if it's a diagnosis of a real lack of mentoring at PhD level, my question is always like, how is throwing more money at that problem or more mentorship at that problem gonna solve it? Because mentors and supervisors and stuff all come from the same pool, the same universe of available academics who offer mentorship or, you know, supervise PhD students or supervise master's students or host postdocs or whatever. So if it's already not working at PhD level, how is it then going to magically work at postdoc level? You know, if people are coming out of their PhDs feeling unready for an academic career, then that says something about the system is not working. Like how then is just adding more of what you've already had on top of that going to solve it, when like it's the same pool of academics who offer that mentorship? So yeah, I think you've put your finger on like one. I don't really have an answer. It's just like that's like I also see it as like the key problem.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay.
Maybe it's just a case of cutting out the middleman and taking that funding for postdoc and putting it more towards PhD and saying, okay, in a PhD, how about adding, being more direct about professional development?
Yeah, I actually think what it should be is about diverting the money from postdoctoral fellowships to jobs. I think that a huge amount of money is spent in the budget, you know, for postdoctoral fellowships. I mean, of course, they're different budgets. You know, some are Department of Science and Innovation, some are DHET and stuff, and some are you know, privately supported by the universities themselves. So it's not all coming from the same source. But I mean, I think it would have made much more sense to just go from a PhD into a job than a PhD into a fellowship. So yeah, but I mean, here's, you know, we have all these ideas, but no one listens, you know, no one cares like what I think. So I don't have like great hopes for this to make any difference.
I see we're close to 2 o'clock. I know Daniel. Daniel, would you like to ask a question?
Hi, yes. Firstly, thank you very much for your presentation. It was fantastic. And as a PhD student reaching the end of my studies, I see the dark tunnel not really having a light at the end. So my question is, what would your suggestion be to a PhD student in next steps? Because you painted the next step as a postdoc as being very doom and gloom. So yeah. What am I to do?
Yeah. I don't really know. I think it's more about directing suggestions towards the universities. They need to have much more honest conversations with PhD students. For a start, they can take off all that misleading stuff from their websites about how a postdoctoral fellowship is preparation for an academic career. And I think that it's what's the word? It's incumbent, or it's the onus should lie on at all levels, the permanent staff who are supervisors, who are heads of department, the managers in the research divisions, to start having more honest conversations with PhD students about this. I'm sorry I can't offer more, you know, more hopeful or more like good advice or stuff. Part of the problem is there's so little research on postdocs, and there's so little research on the academic pipeline involving any form of temporary work that we don't really have figures. I don't know of any research that can tell us what proportion of people who want to pursue an academic career actually get there. So, you know, I can't even say like roughly. Although somebody said that the DVC research here at Stellenbosch once said that 10% of postdocs will end up in permanent jobs. But that was like someone said. So I don't necessarily believe that. But unfortunately, I don't have. I mean, I'm 37 now, and I've been in academic work for a decade. Since my very first permanent job, and it's just been an ongoing struggle. So I don't have like happy suggestions to make, except to seriously think about not working in academia, like keeping your options open, that you could also pursue a career outside of academia. But the other one is just to be forewarned is to be forearmed, in a sense that part of the struggle has been a process of repeated disappointments. But at least if you kind of know what you're getting into, that can sort of mitigate some of the existential crisis that sort of crops up. If you really believed that you were just going to walk into a permanent job, like I sort of did, and I think a lot of people did, at least if you know that, then that can help. But I'm sorry not to have more helpful, concrete suggestions.
Thank you. I really appreciate your honesty.
Okay.
Thank you, Philippa, and for this very exciting and engaging session. And I think there's lots of people who would want to continue the conversation with you beyond the presentation. So I'd like to thank everyone for their input. We are a little bit over, so I'm sorry if there was still more questions and more comments. There is one comment from Sarah Black in the chat. Are you able to see the chat, Philippa?
Yes.
Okay.
Audio.
Yes, and then there's also, okay, you've shared your email, and Sarah has also shared hers. So thank you very much, and I'm sure that these people will contact you and engage with you further. A very important topic, and hopefully our students aren't too discouraged, but it is good, as you say, to be aware that this is what the system is like. So thanks very much, and this presentation has been recorded, and I will make it available to you and also on our YouTube channel. Thanks very much, and and thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Bronwyn, and thank you for all the comments and questions at the end. Yeah. I think it's, can I just say one final thing? I think it's difficult for people who are new to the system, like PhD students and stuff, like it was for me. It's difficult for new people to really believe that it's really like this, because you would think that if it was really like this, why is not more being said about it? And that's exactly part of the problem. There's a kind of the obfuscating discourses are part of the problem, as well as the structures. So it's, there's a kind of enlightening job that I'm hoping to be doing here, which I've benefited from reading tons and tons of the literature and the blogs and the websites about precarious academics. So if for those of you who haven't done that, you can also start diving into things like The Professor is In and various other online sources where there's lots of people complaining and crying about their failed academic careers and stuff. So I mean, I'm sort of half joking, but it really helps to realize, oh, like I'm not the only one. Okay, this is like a whole system. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Philippa. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
All right, bye.